Isabelle Stone had always been drawn to the forbidden. Even as a teenager, she found excitement in skirting the edges of what was acceptable, breaking curfew, sneaking out with friends, daring to be just reckless enough to taste freedom. That thrill had stayed with her into adulthood, manifesting in small ways, taking spontaneous road trips, spending more than she should on indulgent purchases, and saying things that bordered on inappropriate in the right company. But nothing she'd done compared to the fire she felt now. It had all started innocently enough. Isabelle and her husband, Daniel, had moved to their suburban neighborhood a little over a year ago. Their home, nestled in a quiet cul-de-sac, was surrounded by manicured lawns and friendly faces. On paper, they had everything: a comfortable life, steady jobs, and a marriage that had survived its fair share of challenges. But beneath the surface, Isabelle felt something missing. Her days blended together into an endless routine of work and chores, polite conversations with Daniel over dinner, and scrolling mindlessly through her phone in bed. The connection they once shared felt distant, replaced by a kind of companionship that was steady but devoid of passion. Then she met Grant Walters. Grant lived 2 houses down with his wife, Helena, and their teenage daughter. He was charming, quick with a joke, and always seemed to know the right thing to say to make Isabelle laugh. Their interaction started small, casual waves in the driveway, brief conversations about the weather or neighborhood gossip. But it wasn't long before those exchanges grew longer, filled with lingering looks and subtle touches that sent shivers down Isabelle's spine. It was Grant who made the first move. One evening, as they both lingered outside after a neighborhood barbecue, he leaned in close and whispered, "You're dangerous, Isabelle." She had laughed nervously, her heart pounding, but when he brushed his fingers against hers, she didn't pull away. The affair began in the most cliché of ways: stolen kisses in dark corners, hurried rendezvous when their spouses weren't home. Grant made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. With him, there were no grocery lists to discuss or bills to pay, just the raw, electric connection of two people giving in to desire. "I can't stop thinking about you," Grant had said one night, his voice low and filled with longing. They were in his car, parked at the far end of a quiet street. "Me neither," Isabelle had whispered, her hand resting on his cheek. "But we have to be careful. Careful is my middle name," he joked, flashing her that mischievous grin that had first drawn her in. But even as Isabelle laughed, a part of her knew the risks they were taking. This wasn't just a harmless fling, it was a secret that could shatter not just her life, but his as well. Daniel, for his part, seemed oblivious. He worked long hours at his accounting firm and often came home exhausted, more interested in unwinding with a beer and a game than in questioning Isabelle's increasingly frequent absences. "You've been busy lately," he remarked one evening as she returned home after spending the afternoon with Grant. "Just catching up with some friends," Isabelle had replied casually, kissing his cheek. Daniel nodded, seemingly satisfied, and turned back to the television. Isabelle hated the guilt that gnawed at her in moments like these, but it wasn't enough to stop her. The thrill of sneaking around, the way her heart raced every time she and Grant were together, was intoxicating. She told herself it was temporary, just a way to reclaim a part of herself she thought she'd lost. But deep down, she knew it couldn't last forever. One morning, as Isabelle sat on her back porch sipping coffee, her phone buzzed with a message from Grant. "Grant, can't stop thinking about last night. Same time tomorrow?" She smiled, her heart fluttering, and began typing a reply when a second message appeared. "Grant, Helena's going out of town next weekend. You should come over." Isabelle hesitated. She had never set foot inside Grant's home, not wanting to cross that particular line. But the thought of having more time together, of exploring their connection without the constant fear of being caught was tempting. Isabelle, I'll think about it. Grant responded with a winking emoji, and Isabelle felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. As she sat there, her mind racing with the possibilities, she failed to notice the figure watching her from across the street. The following week, Isabelle couldn't stop thinking about Grant's invitation. Every time she passed his house, the curtains drawn and his car parked neatly in the driveway, her pulse quickened. The secrecy of their affair had always been part of the thrill, but the thought of stepping into his home added a new layer of danger and excitement. By Thursday, she had made up her mind. That evening, when Daniel came home, Isabelle casually mentioned a girls' night planned for the weekend. "Sarah and I are going to that new wine bar downtown," she said as she handed him his plate of dinner. "Don't wait up." Daniel nodded absent-mindedly, scrolling through his phone. "Have fun," he said, barely glancing at her. His indifference stung more than Isabelle expected, and for a moment she considered canceling her plans with Grant. But the image of his crooked grin and the warmth of his touch banished her hesitation. She deserved to feel alive. Saturday night arrived, and Isabelle found herself standing in front of Grant's door, her heart pounding. The street was quiet, most of the neighbors either out or tucked away inside their homes. She rang the bell, glancing nervously over her shoulder as she waited. When Grant opened the door, his smile erased her fears. "Come in," he said, pulling her inside. The house was warm and inviting, filled with a scent of fresh coffee and cedarwood. Isabelle hesitated in the entryway, her eyes darting to the family photos on the wall. Helena's smiling face stared back at her, and Isabelle's stomach twisted with guilt. Grant noticed her hesitation and took her hand. "Hey," he said softly, "you're here with me now. That's all that matters." Isabelle let him lead her into the living room, where a bottle of wine and 2 glasses waited on the coffee table. They settled onto the couch, and for a while, Isabelle forgot her unease. They laughed, talked, and kissed like teenagers sneaking a moment away from the world. The evening passed in a haze of whispered confessions and stolen touches. But as Isabelle prepared to leave, the feeling of unease returned. "You're sure Helena's out of town?" she asked, slipping on her coat. "Positive," Grant said, walking her to the door. "She's visiting her sister until Monday. You're safe, I promise." Isabelle nodded, though the knot in her stomach didn't loosen. She kissed him one last time before stepping out into the cool night air. The street was silent as she walked to her car, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the shadows, but saw nothing. Shaking her head, she got into the car and drove home, her heart pounding the entire way. The next morning, Isabelle awoke to a strange sense of foreboding. She brushed it off, chalking it up to her nerves from the night before, and went about her day as usual. By the afternoon, however, her unease had grown. She was cleaning the kitchen when her phone buzzed with a text. It was from Grant. "Grant, Helena came back early. She knows." Isabelle's breath caught in her throat. Her hand shook as she typed a reply. "Isabelle, what do you mean she knows? What happened?" The 3 dots indicating his response appeared and disappeared several times before his reply finally came. "Grant, she saw us last night. She didn't say anything at the time, but this morning, it's bad, Isabelle. I'm sorry." Panic coursed through her veins as she read the words. "Helena saw us? How?" Isabelle thought back to the quiet street, the shadows that had made her uneasy. Had Helena been there, watching from the darkness? Before Isabelle could respond, there was a loud knock at the door. Her heart leapt into her throat. She stood frozen in the kitchen, staring at the door as the knock came again, harder this time. "Isabelle!" a voice called. I know you're in there. Open up. It was a woman's voice, sharp, furious, and unmistakably Helena's. Isabelle's mind raced. How did she find me? What does she want? The knocking grew louder, more insistent. You think you can sneak around with my husband and get away with it? Open the damn door. Isabelle's legs felt like jelly as she made her way to the door. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Helena, I don't think this is a good idea, she said, her voice trembling. Open the door, Isabelle, Helena said coldly, or I'll make a scene your whole neighborhood will hear. Isabelle's hand trembled as it hovered over the doorknob. Behind the door, Helena's voice was sharp and unrelenting, each word hitting like a strike to her chest. Open the door, Isabelle, Helena shouted, her voice rising. Or I'll make sure everyone on this street knows what kind of woman you are. Isabelle closed her eyes, her chest heaving as she tried to calm her racing heart. How did it come to this? She thought. Just days ago, the affair had felt thrilling, intoxicating, like a private rebellion against her stifling life. Now, it felt like everything was about to collapse. With a deep breath, Isabelle turned the lock and opened the door. Helena stood on the porch, her arms crossed and her eyes blazing with fury. She was dressed impeccably, her tailored coat and perfect makeup a stark contrast to the raw anger radiating from her. Helena, Isabelle began, her voice barely audible. Don't you dare, Helena snapped, stepping inside uninvited. Don't you dare try to explain yourself. Isabelle stepped back, her mouth dry. She had faced plenty of confrontation in her life, arguments with friends, tense moments at work, but nothing like this. Helena's presence was overwhelming, and Isabelle felt completely unprepared. Helena glanced around the house, her gaze settling briefly on the framed photos of Isabelle and Daniel that adorned the living room. She let out a bitter laugh. Cozy little life you have here, she said. Does your husband know what you've been doing behind his back? Isabelle's cheeks burned. Please, Helena, let's talk about this calmly. I never meant to. You never meant to what? Helena interrupted, her voice rising. You never meant to get caught? You never meant to destroy my family? I didn't want to hurt anyone, Isabelle said, tears welling in her eyes. Helena's laughter was sharp and humorless. You didn't want to hurt anyone? You were sleeping with my husband, Isabelle. Did you think there wouldn't be consequences? Isabelle's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, breaking the tense silence. Both women glanced at it, and Isabelle's stomach sank as she saw Grant's name flash across the screen. Is that him? Helena asked coldly. Isabelle hesitated, and that was all the confirmation Helena needed. She snatched the phone off the counter, her movements quick and deliberate. Helena, please, Isabelle said, reaching out, but Helena held up a hand to stop her. Let's see what lover boy has to say, Helena said, unlocking the phone with ease. The messages from Grant were displayed in a neat thread. Grant, she knows. I'm so sorry. Grant, we need to figure out what to do. Grant, don't answer the door if she shows up. Helena let out a humorless laugh as she read the messages aloud. Oh, he's sorry, is he? How touching. Isabelle felt a wave of shame wash over her. She had never meant for things to spiral out of control like this. Helena, stop, Helena snapped, throwing the phone onto the counter. I don't want to hear your excuses. The sound of the front door opening startled them both. Isabelle turned to see Daniel standing in the doorway, his briefcase in hand, and a look of confusion on his face. What's going on here? Daniel asked, his gaze darting between the two women. Helena straightened, smoothing her coat as if preparing for battle. Daniel, is it? She said, her voice icy. Yes, he said slowly. And you are? I'm Helena Walters, she said, her tone sharp. Your wife has been having an affair with my husband. The words hung in the air like a bombshell, and Daniel's face went pale. He turned to Isabelle, his eyes wide with disbelief. Is that true? Isabelle's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her silence was answer enough. Unbelievable, Daniel said, his voice low and filled with anger. He set his briefcase down with a thud and ran a hand through his hair. How long has this been going on? Ask her, Helena said, crossing her arms. Isabelle's tears spilled over as she finally found her voice. 6 months, she said quietly. Daniel let out a bitter laugh, his hands on his hips as he paced the room. 6 months? You've been lying to me for half a year, and I had no idea. I'm so sorry, Daniel, Isabelle said, her voice shaking. I never meant to hurt you. That seems to be your favorite line, Helena said coldly. Daniel stopped pacing and turned to Isabelle, his expression hard. Why, Isabelle? Why would you do this to us? To me? Isabelle wiped at her tears, her shoulders trembling. I felt invisible, she admitted. We'd stopped talking, stopped connecting. I didn't know how to fix it, and then Grant, he made me feel seen. Daniel shook his head, his jaw tight. So instead of talking to me, you turned to him? You threw away our marriage for some cheap thrill? It wasn't like that, Isabelle said weakly. Of course it was, Helena interjected. That's all it ever is. Helena stepped forward, her eyes blazing. I hope it was worth it, she said, her voice cold. Because you've destroyed more than just your marriage, Isabelle. My daughter knows. She saw the texts. She's devastated. And now I have to pick up the pieces of my life because of you. Isabelle felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. She hadn't thought about Helena's family, about how her actions would ripple outward and hurt people she'd never even met. Helena turned to Daniel, her expression softening slightly. I'm sorry you had to find out like this, she said, but you deserve to know. Daniel nodded, his face still etched with disbelief. Helena turned back to Isabelle, her voice sharp once more. I hope you take a long, hard look at yourself, she said, and I hope it was worth it. With that, she walked out, leaving Isabelle and Daniel standing in the silence. The sound of the door slamming shut echoed through the house, leaving Isabelle standing frozen in place, her face streaked with tears. Daniel was still in the living room, his hands on his hips, staring at the floor as though trying to piece together what had just happened. Daniel, Isabelle said softly, stepping toward him. Don't, he snapped, his voice sharper than she had ever heard it. He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and pain. Don't even try to explain. I can't listen to you right now. But I need to. What? Apologize? Tell me it didn't mean anything? That you didn't want to hurt me? He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. I've already heard it all, Isabelle. And none of it makes this any better. Isabelle stood helplessly, her words dying in her throat. She had prepared for guilt, for anger, but nothing could have readied her for the heartbreak in Daniel's voice. The hours that followed were agonizing. Daniel retreated to the guest bedroom, slamming the door shut behind him. Isabelle sat on the edge of their bed, staring at the framed wedding photo on the dresser. They looked so happy in that picture, young and hopeful, ready to take on the world together. How had it all gone so wrong? She reached for her phone, desperate to find some sense of control. There were new messages from Grant. Grant, Helena's furious. She's threatening to leave me. I'm sorry she showed up at your place. Are you okay? Grant, please call me. Isabelle's hands tightened around the phone. The apology felt, can a relationship survive after infidelity, or is it always doomed? Write in the comments. Hollow. How could Grant not realize the damage he'd done, not just to her life, but to his own family? She deleted the messages without responding. The next morning, Isabelle woke to the sound of Daniel moving around the house. She found him in the kitchen, his suitcase packed and sitting by the door. "What's this?" Isabelle asked, her voice cracking. "I'm leaving," Daniel said flatly. "Leaving? For how long?" "I don't know," he replied, not meeting her eyes. "I need space. I need time to figure out what the hell I'm supposed to do with this, with us." "Daniel, please," Isabelle said, stepping closer. "Don't do this. We can work through this. I'll do whatever it takes." Daniel finally looked at her, and the sadness in his eyes made her chest ache. "How am I supposed to work through this, Isabelle? How am I supposed to trust you again?" She reached for him, but he stepped back, shaking his head. "I can't be here right now," he said. "I'll let you know when I'm ready to talk." And then he was gone. The silence in the house was deafening. Isabelle wandered aimlessly from room to room, each one filled with memories of the life she and Daniel had built together. Now, those memories felt tainted, overshadowed by the choices she'd made. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a call from Vanessa, her best friend. "Isabelle," Vanessa said when she answered, her voice heavy with concern. "I just heard. Helena's been telling everyone in the neighborhood." "What happened?" Isabelle felt her throat tighten. "It's all true," she admitted. "I've been seeing Grant." Vanessa let out a long sigh. "Isabelle, what were you thinking? He's married. You're married. Did you really think this wouldn't come out?" "I didn't think," Isabelle said, tears streaming down her face. "I wasn't thinking about anything except how unhappy I was. And now I've ruined everything." "You need to fix this," Vanessa said firmly. "Whatever it takes. Start with Daniel. He deserves better than this." Over the next few days, Isabelle tried to reach out to Daniel, but every call went unanswered, and every text was met with silence. She spent her nights replaying their last conversation in her mind, her guilt consuming her. Meanwhile, the whispers in the neighborhood grew louder. Isabelle could feel the stares when she walked outside, the way conversations seemed to stop whenever she entered a room. Helena had made good on her threat to make a scene, and now Isabelle was the talk of the town. Grant reached out again, sending message after message. "Grant, I miss you. Grant, I don't know what to do without you. Grant, please, let's talk." But Isabelle couldn't bring herself to respond. Every time she thought of him, she felt nothing but regret. One evening, there was a knock at the door. Isabelle opened it to find Helena standing on the porch once again, her expression cold. "What do you want?" Isabelle asked, her voice weary. "I came to tell you something," Helena said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Grant's leaving. He's packing his things and moving out. I thought you'd want to know." Isabelle stared at her in disbelief. "He's leaving you?" "No," Helena said sharply. "I'm kicking him out. I told him I'd never forgive him for what he's done, to me, to our daughter, to our family. He's a coward, and I'm done pretending otherwise." Isabelle felt a pang of guilt, but Helena wasn't finished. "I want you to know something," she said, her voice low. "You think you were special to him? You weren't. You were just convenient. He'll find someone else, and he'll do the same thing to her. That's who he is. And now, thanks to him, and you, my family is broken." Isabelle's tears spilled over as Helena turned and walked out, leaving her alone once again. The days after Helena's visit passed in a haze of self-recrimination. Isabelle sat in the empty house, the silence pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't lift. Daniel hadn't returned, and her texts and voicemails remained unanswered. She had destroyed her marriage, her reputation, and even the illusion of excitement that had drawn her to Grant in the first place. The neighborhood whispers were impossible to ignore. Every time Isabelle stepped outside, she felt the stares from her neighbors, heard the muffled conversations that stopped abruptly when she walked by. Even Vanessa, her closest friend, had begun pulling away, her calls growing infrequent and her tone distant. Isabelle was isolated in every sense of the word. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Isabelle's phone buzzed. She stared at it for a long moment before picking it up. The name on the screen made her chest tighten. Daniel. She answered on the second ring, her voice trembling. Daniel? His tone was calm but distant, each word deliberate. I think we need to talk. Please, Isabelle said quickly. I've been waiting for this. When can I see you? Tomorrow, Daniel said. Come to the diner on Maple Street at noon. I don't want to do this at the house. Okay, Isabelle said, her heart pounding. I'll be there. The line went dead, and Isabelle set the phone down, her hand shaking. The next day, Isabelle arrived at the diner 15 minutes early, her nerves on edge. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say a dozen times, but now that the moment was here, her mind was blank. She sat in a booth near the window, staring out at the street as she waited for Daniel to arrive. When he walked in, his face was unreadable. He looked tired, his normally neat appearance slightly unkempt. He slid into the seat across from her, folding his hands on the table. Thank you for meeting me, Isabelle said, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel nodded, his eyes fixed on hers. I'll start, he said. I've had a lot of time to think over the past week, and I've come to a decision. Isabelle held her breath, her stomach churning. I can't do this anymore, Daniel said, his tone firm. I can't be married to someone who lied to me, who betrayed me like this. Tears filled Isabelle's eyes. Daniel, please, I know I hurt you. I know I made terrible mistakes. But I love you. I never stopped loving you. Daniel shook his head, his expression softening just slightly. Love isn't enough, Isabelle. You broke my trust, and without that, we have nothing. You didn't just hurt me, you humiliated me. You made me question everything about our life together. Isabelle's voice broke as she whispered, I'll do whatever it takes to make it up to you. Counseling, therapy, anything. Just give me a chance. Daniel sighed, leaning back in his seat. I've already given you so many chances, Isabelle. You made a choice to betray me, and now I'm making a choice to put myself first. Isabelle's tears spilled over, and she reached for his hand, but he pulled away. I'll make this as easy as I can, Daniel said, his tone calm. You can keep the house. I'll take care of the paperwork. But I need to move on. We both do. Daniel, please, Isabelle said, her voice cracking. He stood, looking down at her with a mixture of sadness and resolve. I wish things had been different, he said quietly. But this is the end. With that, he walked out, leaving Isabelle sitting alone in the booth, her vision blurred by tears. The divorce was finalized 2 months later. True to his word, Daniel made the process as painless as possible, but Isabelle knew it was because he wanted to be done with her. He moved to a new city, started fresh, and cut all ties. Meanwhile, Isabelle stayed in the house, but it no longer felt like home. The walls seemed to echo with reminders of the life she'd thrown away, the love she'd taken for granted. Grant tried reaching out a few times, his messages alternating between apologies and pleas to see her again. Isabelle ignored them all. Helena's words had stuck with her. You were just convenient. The thought of being with Grant now was repulsive. Helena had followed through on her promise to end things with Grant. Word spread quickly that she had filed for divorce and was moving with her daughter to start over. Months passed, and the whispers in the neighborhood eventually faded. But Isabelle's isolation remained. She spent her days working, her evenings alone, and her nights plagued by regret. One evening, she sat on the back porch, staring out at the darkened sky. Her phone buzzed with a message, a rare occurrence these days. She picked it up and saw a text from Vanessa. "Vanessa, I hope you're okay. If you ever want to talk, I'm here." Isabelle stared at the message for a long moment before typing a reply. "Isabelle, thank you. I'd like that." As she set the phone down, a single tear slid down her cheek. She knew she couldn't undo the damage she had caused, but she could try to pick up the pieces. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope, just a little, that she could find a way to rebuild. But the scars of her choices would always remain.